So for those who are not here yesterday, I'll introduce Summer. And yeah, so Summer has an extended experience in statistical consulting and statistical modeling in many sectors, for example, government and also academia. She has worked with many types of models from Bayesian statistics, frequentist statistics, machine learning algorithms. So she's familiar with a range of methods of quantitative but also qualitative statistics, most recently working at Griffith, doing mixed methods research as well, and she's going through that in her talk. And yeah, so very knowledgeable, and I'm biased. She was my PhD supervisor, so it's a great supervisor as well. So yeah, looking forward for her to share her knowledge on emerging multiculture of statistical paradigm.
Well, thank you very much. Lovely introduction, Daniela. Yes, as Daniela mentioned, I sit at Griffith University as a senior statistician in the Arts Education Law Group, but I report to 4 deans research across the university. I also sit in the Institute of Education Research and in the Centre for Planetary Health and Food Security. So I do research as well as advising, which is my teaching load. So thank you to the organisers of the mini conference. It's a wonderful opportunity to try and teach you what I learned when I started at Griffith University about 7 years ago. The whole mixed methods array of doing things really opened up my eyes, not just to all the qualitative ways of doing things or ways of combining quant-qual, but just a different way of looking at your quantitative research methods approaches. So sitting back and rethinking things. I'd like to just acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where we're all meeting. I'm sitting in Quandamooka country, and this includes an acknowledgement of the elders, past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to really thank my clients and collaborators and students who've asked the questions and helped push my boundaries and my learning about these multiple paradigms. So if you look at my bio, you can see I've always been very interested in the clashes of paradigms. And so as an honours student, I was reading the discussions in the Royal Statistical Society, and as a PhD student, it was frequentist versus Bayesian. And in government, that kind of died down, and people were more accepting of multiple approaches. And I've certainly found that in the qualitative arena, there tends to be less vitriol and more acceptance of multi-method. So this talk, just revisiting my abstract, I'm really talking about this vast array of choices for statistical approaches. And for you, I'm trying to unpack the different paradigms or ways of thinking about statistics, and therefore how that affects your methodology and method, and how other people might be thinking and how that affects your communications with them. So there'll be 4 areas of the talk. I'll start off looking at the diversity of statistical paradigms. I'll introduce a bit of philosophy, because a lot of us who did a PhD, which is a doctorate in philosophy, unfortunately, we're expected to absorb philosophy by osmosis. And so the practice of actually being more explicit in that is more developed in the quantitative fields. So I'll give you a little taste of that in case you didn't, pursue that yourself. And then I'll look at unpacking some of the paradigms, the ways of doing statistics, and I'll finish with some concluding remarks about inclusivity, how we can be more inclusive in statistical thinking to embrace all the different approaches and understand that there are many different ways of looking at things, and that these can all be valuable in different ways. So to start off with looking at this diversity of statistical paradigms, here we're looking at all the different statistical approaches which are interpreting and analysing data. And in particular, because we're statisticians, we're interested in understanding and representing uncertainty, which may sometimes involve a model, although other times it's an algorithm. So if we look at all the a multifaceted way of looking at a data set or answering a problem, we could take the classical approach with null hypothesis testing, significance and p-values from the 50s, null hypothesis testing from the 30s, a frequentist or classical approach, a Bayesian approach, which is 300 years old, but computation's only about 40 years old, likelihood analysis, which is a variation on significance and p-values kind of ideas by Fisher, resampling methods, which include the bagging that we were just listening to, and bootstrapping, jackknifing, and cross-validation, mathematical or deterministic models, spatial analysis using geographic information systems, Monte Carlo simulation, risk assessment, fuzzy logic, entropy, data analysis, and there's many others I'm sure you could add to this. Please put it in the Slack if you think of something else I've missed. And then I'll put data science last. It's hard to see how that fits in as a method, because in some cases it includes these methods and other times it's seen as a separate entity. So that just gives you an idea that there are many different approaches to analysing data with a statistical kind of lens. Even a mathematical modelling approach, you can do the uncertainty analysis after the fact, which includes Monte Carlo sampling, which is fundamentally a statistical idea. So one way to organise all this information about all the different approaches for doing statistics is to consider the philosophical structure that people are using. And so in qual circles, these are referred to as the ologies. So basically there's axiology, ontology, epistemology, and methodology. So that's why they're called ologies. And these help you organise the philosophical differences that exist among statistical approaches. And it stems from a philosophical kind of rigour that exists in the qualitatively qual-dominant areas of research. So in terms of a philosophy, you could say that at the centre of a quant view of a philosophy, a way of doing statistics, is the method. So often in a stats paper, a quant paper, it will focus on the method, the steps that are used to analyse the data. Underneath the method, you can read in between the lines in the introduction, usually, it will tell you the axiology, like what are the values of the researcher, what matters and why. And in those cases, sometimes that is driving the choice of method. Someone's using a hammer. Another aspect, the second ology is ontology, which is about how things are defined. So one of the speakers in the session just before was talking about how all the definitions changed as you went across countries. So that's an example where the ontology could change. For example, the definition of death, which is important to reporting COVID outcomes or morbidity. Those things do change across countries and over time. And so when you're comparing things, you need to sometimes take that into account. Then there's the logical approach, or the epistemology, which is the general way that you're trying to use evidence to make your point. Now, a lot of people get confused about the difference between methodology, which is the general view of how you did what you did, the who, the where, the when, and the which, whereas the method is the very specific steps that were chosen. So I'll give some examples to help define that difference. Indeed, you could put method and methodology in the same bucket and then talk about theory being at the centre of the philosophy, which is how qualitative researchers think of things. The theoretical framework is the one that in fact is seen as driving the way that they do things. So for instance, a theorist in a field could say that we have a behavioural model for describing how people are behaving in their response to a psychometric survey, for example. So the theoretical approach is sometimes not stated, and it actually shapes all these other things as well. And it shapes the definitions you use, the ontologies, the conventions that the assumptions that are built into your method and methodology, and the meaning of things, which reveals your axiology. So the The method and the methodology are the general and specific nature of exactly what was done in your study. And as we all know and have become very aware of over the last decade or so, it's important to be clear on this so that others can reproduce or replicate your research. So I'd like to just use an example to try and show you what we mean by these ologies. So one of the things that we use in our training of on critical inquiry for methods, so how people think about method and report on method across qual or quant methods at Griffith, is we use this jellyfish study that was published in The Conversation. It talks about how some time-poor scientists inadvertently came up with the wrong idea that the world was overrun with jellyfish. So they looked into how could that have happened. And this paper is the one that has the initial idea that's kind of summarized for general consumption in the Conversation article. And so this scientific paper says that the reason they came to this wrong conclusion that the world was overrun with jellyfish is that there were a lot of flawed citation practices. So people were basically misreading the literature and then using meta-analysis techniques in the wrong way to come to their conclusions. So what was interesting to me, however, is that they did a meta-analysis across very different methods, research methods, statistical methods. And so here we're not going to be looking at this flawed citation practice, but diving in underneath and looking at some of the papers here and their research methods as a way of showing you how the different ologies can materialize. So the first ology I'll talk about is epistemology, the logical approach. Has anyone heard of that before? Can you put your hand up in the Zoom if you have heard of that before? And perhaps, Daniela, you could count for me. I seem to have lost that screen at the moment. But if you could count for me, if anyone's heard of epistemology before.
Could only count 4.
Okay,
with myself.
Yeah, so.
Now more.
Yeah, okay. The whole idea of epistemology is that there's a lot of different pathways to analyze the same data. Or as George Martin said, there's different roads that sometimes lead to the very same castle. So, you know, and sometimes when you do statistical consulting, you may find out after the fact that your very sneaky client has actually sent out the same project to several competing research groups to analyze the same problem and has allowed them to come, you know, use whatever different approach, you know, some qual, some quant to answer the same question, and then looked at the results after the fact. Other times this approach is much more explicit, or even the same research team can choose to use multiple methods or a mix of quant and qual methods. So in this case, in the papers that were discussed in the jellyfish review, one paper was simply counting 2 species of jellyfish. I won't even attempt to pronounce their names. Another paper was actually cutting over bigger fish and counting how many jellyfish were in their stomachs. And another paper was actually asking experts what they thought to try and get a broader look. So these papers were looking in specific places, and then the expert-based elicitation was able to cover a much larger area because of the method. So if we focus on this paper, which was published in 2001 and was cited a lot in all these meta-analyses that were critiqued in the jellyfish review, we can have a look at how the axiology, ontology, and methodology, and the method and theory came out in that one paper. So the values that the researchers hold is referred to as the axiology, the axis on which all their approaches are hinging, I guess you could say. This statement right in the beginning of the article, it reveals that they're interested in long-term ecosystem change. Another sentence in the introduction is talking about how there's, increased jellyfish production could be a symptom of larger marine ecosystem degradation. So this reveals a conservation kind of set of values, which is emphasized again when they're talking about highly fished regions. So these are regions under threat. And now they're talking about the difference between natural and human-induced modifications of this ecosystem. So that reveals an interest in human impacts. So if you read through the introduction, you get a feeling for the axiology of the researcher, what they're really valuing, and therefore what they're going to be focusing on in the research. In terms of methodology, we're generally looking at how the study was done, who was involved, what was done, where, when, and which type of approach. So an example of who is that they were just hooking into the United States National Marine Fisheries Service, where there's a map which shows some subdivision. So there was stratified sampling. They tell you when, it's a 10-year period. And then in the title, you know which species they're looking at, and they're looking in shifts of those populations in that area. The method is more specifically how the study was done, and this is where you get the details in the methods section on stratified surveys and the null hypothesis testing that was done, which was rejecting the null hypothesis of no change if they did find a change between years that was larger than the usual when you had no change. So in terms of ontology, I won't go through all the definitions in this paper, but just give you one example which is relevant to statistics. They had a focus on the change in the jellyfish population, but because you're just catching jellyfish, you don't know exactly how the catch relates to the actual population. You would need another study to tell you about that efficiency of sampling. So all they're doing is focusing on the change in the catch. Looking at means over years. And so this meaning then translates to the theory and the other elements of the philosophy. That's a very important aspect to the ontology, because it defines what they're talking about here when they talk about change. It's a change in averages, and an average of catch, not population. So underlying null hypothesis testing, there is a theory. Popper came up with falsifiability, which was an important concept for science and philosophy about science. He was very interested in whether establishing whether studies were scientific or not, for example, about extraterrestrials or whether people had psychic powers. And so he came up with a theory about how to tell if something was science. And one of these criteria he developed was the falsifiability criterion, which was, if something could be falsifiable using evidence, then you were conducting science. So you might say that if we want to summarize all these ologies just of a null hypothesis testing approach, here the axiology was that we were doing a confirmatory analysis, testing whether the data was consistent with the null hypothesis. The ontology was that we were looking at statistical significance, which is defined in a particular way under null hypothesis testing. Epistemology, we're counting the number of jellyfish. We're not asking experts or looking in the stomachs of fish. The theoretical perspective was to apply Popper's idea of falsifiability. The methodology is null hypothesis testing, and the specific elements of method are to do with, choosing Spearman's rank test, doing stratified sampling, and using a specific fishing trawler sampling protocol. So if we want to unpack, what different choices there are for paradigms, because this is just one choice, one way of doing the statistics. So to unpack this, we're up to part 3 now, unpack these paradigms, we can actually start thinking like a qualitative researcher and look at statistical approaches. And interestingly, what I found is that most qualitative researchers have only ever seen null hypothesis testing, and they think that's the whole of statistics, and they consider that a positivist approach. And you might ask, what does that mean? What is a positivist approach? If I'm a qual person looking at a gazillion different ways of analysing their data, in a qualitative way, why did they just stick statistical analysis in this one little box labeled positivist? So positivism, according to the Oxford Languages Dictionary online, is a philosophy where you're looking at stuff that can be scientifically verified, capable of logical or mathematical proof, and so you're rejecting, you know, anything that's metaphysical or theological. And null hypothesis testing and Popper's falsification criterion fall into this bucket of positivism. So you could say that, you know, those columns that I showed you before could be filled out for a number of different paradigms. Some very common paradigms that are present in qualitative approaches are constructivism or interpretive approaches, pragmatism, subjectivism, and critical approaches. And in fact, this list of paradigms is from a web page which explains the research paradigm in simple ways. I chose that one as being accessible to quantitative researchers, although of course there are whole books on the subject. So this is just an initial in for people wanting to get their head around the big ideas. And Patel had this big table. The details are, you know, don't worry about that too much, just focus on this first row of positivism, where the method that is included here includes the whole of statistical analysis, in addition to sampling and measurement and scales, such as in structural equation models, and focus groups and interviews, all fall in that one bucket. So it's positivism, which includes statistical analysis. And in fact, if you look at a lot of qualitative methods texts, they all consider that the whole of statistical analysis is positivist. Being Bayesian, of course, where I rely on expert opinion from time to time, I've often been criticised in a friendly way in Bayesian meetings for being a wild, subjective Bayesian, like Anthony O'Hagan. And so I was wondering whether anyone had looked at Bayesian methods from that approach. I was looking at, so I wanted to go through the different isms, the paradigms, and think about what kinds of statistical techniques might fall into these other buckets. So one bucket was labeled pragmatism. And according to the Oxford Languages, this is an approach that evaluates theories or beliefs in terms of the success of their practical application. So have a think about that for a minute and perhaps type into the chat or the Slack channel whether you believe what kinds of approaches you think fall into that kind of bucket, what sort of quant approaches. Did we get any responses, Daniela?
Not yet.
No. Don't know why, but I can't see my Zoom window. Done something to it. Yeah, so two approaches come to mind to me. Exploratory approaches to statistical analysis, where you check what model fits the data, or machine learning approaches, where you choose a model or an algorithm based on the predictive fit to the data.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. So Betsy, sorry, Sama. So Betsy said data science, it seems to be whatever works.
Yeah, so machine learning and data science take on this pragmatist approach. And so you can see already that if you put a pragmatist and a positivist in the same room, they might be having disagreements because of a fundamental difference in their philosophies. Constructivism is similar to like some of the latter talks we were talking about, where you have proofs and you have lemmas and you know, results that arise from the proofs of certain properties. So these mathematical kinds of approaches are common in econometrics, for instance, where they have laws, and then statistical methods arise from applying those laws. That's been called a deductive nomological approach in the quant area. But that, yeah, so that's a different approach compared to a positivist or a pragmatic approach. And then subjectivism is where knowledge is considered subjective and there is no external truth. So in a fully subjective Bayesian approach, for instance, you might find that you're relying on the decision maker, the DM, as the person who's assigning the model and assigning the weights, the prior weights, and deciding on what parameters are important. Risk assessment, similarly, which relies on expert knowledge, takes a subjective approach. Or as in our first presentation this morning, looking at different dairy products and evaluating those. They're all subjective kinds of measures. So what I invite you to do during this talk or afterwards is to add your ideas to the Slack. If you can think of a statistical approach, perhaps your favorite one or one you're interested in looking at, and have a think about its ologies. So the interesting thing I found was that we were talking about using a new Bayesian approach to analysing some educational experimental data together with interviews, so it's mixed methods. And the editors of this digital special issue in education asked us explicitly to talk about the ologies of a Bayesian approach to statistical modelling. I looked everywhere. I couldn't find anything written about it. It must be buried. I can't possibly be the first person to talk about it. But if you want to have a look, it's in this paper, details at the end.
5 minutes.
Yeah. So to finish up, we're talking about inclusivity in statistical thinking. As you can see, there's a wide range of statistical approaches, and underlying, the thousands of different ways of doing statistics, the thousands of different or millions of different methods, perhaps these key differences that can be described in terms of the ologies. So depending on the statistical paradigm that people are using, they may perceive other people's ologies as biases or differences. So I just invite you to perhaps think that, when someone does an analysis, the person doing the analysis and the person asking the question are looking at the information in different ways through different kinds of telescopes. And each telescope, may be using a different method, which reveals a different underlying theoretical framework, conceptual framework, and may reflect their different philosophies in terms of what they consider important, what they value, the axiology, how they've defined things, the ontology, their general use of evidence, the epistemology, and then the method and methodology and how they've gone about that. So I think Pat Wador's really summed it up here. I've just slightly noted that when we consider what organisation could mean here, we could listen and celebrate to these differences across our community of users and developers of statistical methods. So as a postscript, I'd really invite you to, I'll supply the slides to Daniela to share with everyone, but please feel free to annotate the resources, add a little comment in Slack, have a post-conference discussion about any suggested readings you might come across, perhaps even a round table of how useful a particular reference was to you. And if you're really inspired, perhaps add to the table of paradigms, suggest some new entries. What would you like to see added to that table? So some suggestions for further reading. This is the paper that I wrote with Tasha Riley, who's an education scientist, and I've been working on Indigenous statistics with Tasha, as well as social justice kinds of education issues. And then Claire Alston-Knox develops Bayesian software, and she has taught with me previously, so we have a shared interest in teaching Bayesian ideas. And then this book here, the Oxford Handbook of Multi-Method and Mixed Methods, in research inquiry I found very useful as an introduction to anyone with a quant perspective or a qual perspective wanting to broaden their mind about qual and quant perspectives. And it just is a really good way into this whole other literature or different way of looking at how methods differ. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Selma. Great talk. We have a few comments in the Slack channel. And so Boeing asked, would subjective based do a sensitivity analysis to see how the results of the analysis depend on various choices of prior?
So the difference in the approaches has to do, that's a good question. So not all Bayesian is subjectivist. In fact, you know, the last few Bayesian conferences I've gone to, I would say there's only half a dozen subjective Bayesians there. And the rest are really more pragmatists. They're fitting to the data, fitting models to the data. Sometimes they're theorists and they're constructing, you know, doing proofs about properties of Bayesian estimators, but oftentimes they're taking a pragmatic approach. And in a pragmatic approach, you would look at how the different priors are affecting your results. And so the sensitivity analysis might fall into that pragmatist kind of headspace. So what I'm interested in at the moment is that I think Bayesian is not a single ism. It sort of cuts across the different paradigms, ways of thinking as listed, for example, by Patel. So yeah, Bayesian cuts across some of these things. I'd be interested in what people think.
There are quite a few comments on Slack. I think we'll be glad to see a great discussion there going. And I also have created a channel for this keynote if people are interested continue the discussion after the conference as well, or interested in the topic of doing the conference, to add things there. Yeah. But perhaps
yeah, I'll
be just checking the time. Otherwise,
yeah, I'll answer all those questions in Slack, and you can save 5 minutes and get ahead of time.
Yes, that sounds great. Thank you so much, Sama. Please join me in thanking Sama for the great talk. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sama. So perhaps before our next, let me see if I'm just looking at the program to make sure that I have my time correct. Yeah. So we can have again 2 minutes break before the next session. Or yeah, 2 minutes and 4 minutes break. So we come back at 1 at Australian Standard Time. 4 minutes break. And some I can keep. Or we can keep the discussion if people don't want to make a break. Yeah, but if you answer in Slack, I think it'll be easier for people to follow up. There's quite a few comments there.
Yeah, I'll answer the comments in the Slack during this.
Yeah, or later on. Thank you very much. And please feel free to join. The name of the channel is Keynote Multi-Paradigm Stats. If you want to join that channel, you can join that. So it's just for people interested in keeping that conversation going. Thank you very much.